So his idea, obviously, is to force a rebalancing of international trade relations. But I would go even further than this. His objective is to force a new structure of international trade.
Hello and welcome to The Focus. I'm Dr. John Bruni. On today's episode, we dive into one of the most contentious economic tools of the Trump era: tariffs. From steel and aluminium to Chinese electronics and European goods, Donald Trump's trade war has reshaped global markets, fractured long-standing alliances, and redefined America's role in the global economy. But what have these tariffs really achieved? To help unpack Trump's tariffs, I'm joined by returning guest Nicolas Michelon. Nicolas Michelon is the founder and chief editor of Asia Power Watch, a publication focused on the intersection of economic power, strategic competition, and geopolitical dynamics across the Indo-Pacific. Based in France, Nicolas is a political economist and corporate strategist with over 20 years of experience in Asia-focused advisory roles. He is also the managing partner at Allegan Partners, a consultancy specializing in corporate geoeconomics, market access, and strategic intelligence. Let's dive in. Nicolas, welcome back to The Focus.
Thank you, John, for having me again.
Nicolas, President Trump's Liberation Day tariffs have been credited with triggering a sharp downturn in global growth projections, with the World Bank cutting global GDP to just 2.3% for 2025. From your vantage point as an economist, how do you interpret these global economic impacts? Do these tariffs reflect a viable long-term trade strategy or a destabilizing shock to an already fragile system?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, John. I think it's a multi-layered strategy on the part of President Trump and the 2.0 version of him. First of all, we have to remember that he did start something similar, albeit not to the same extent, in his first administration before COVID. If we remember, one of the first executive orders that he signs, that is trade related, is increasing tariffs on aluminum and steel coming from his own allies, the European Union, Canada, and Mexico. And then
Australia.
And Australia too.
Yeah.
Australia too, absolutely. And then, of course, he starts the beginning of this trade war with China. He then managed to coerce China into signing some sort of a deal, which was called a phase one trade deal, basically, sending us the message that there might be a phase two or phase three possibly, which he didn't have the time to actually put in motion. If we remember the phase one trade deal, the idea was that China would commit to importing more from the US, albeit to try to rebalance America's structural trade deficit with China. It was a political victory for Trump in the sense that he could go back to his electors and his supporters and say, see, I told you, China can be coerced into more balanced trade relations. When you look at the numbers, the economics didn't work because all China did was increase imports of agricultural goods. And you're going to have to eat a lot of soybeans and a lot of pork chops to make up for the added value of semiconductors and electronics that that China was exporting to the US. So it was a political victory, but an economic defeat. This time around, he's basically using the same playbook, but just cranking it up a few notches. So his idea, obviously, is to force a rebalancing of international trade relations. But I would go even further than this. His objective is to force a new structure of international trade. He's also trying to coerce American companies and international companies into manufacturing more into the US. Hence the increase in tariffs. The idea is that if your alternative is to pay 50% or plus tariffs to export to the US, you might as well actually produce in the US. I do think that in many sectors there's going to be a glass ceiling anyway, because I mean we've all seen the memes of Americans trying to produce textile in the US, those very ugly memes.
Yes.
But I think it's very true. I mean, when you've abandoned entire sectors of your industry for almost half a century. I mean, how sure are you that you can actually restart it from scratch? Do you still have the engineers to do that? Besides, those industries now in many sectors, like automobile, for example, where he's also trying to coerce automakers into producing more in the US, many of the automakers are getting closer and closer every day to what we call dark factories, which is basically factories operating with absolutely zero human interaction, only robots. So if those companies do that, that's not going to recreate any industrial employment whatsoever in the US. So I do think that I do understand the narrative that is pushing. He has electors to please. He has to show them that, see, I'm delivering on that promise. I do believe that there are a lot of glass ceilings. And then we have many other objectives, which are totally outside of the strict realm of international trade. I do believe that with these announcements of those absolutely outrageous, supposedly reciprocal tariffs which have absolutely nothing reciprocal to them. If you look at the formula, I mean, the formula makes absolutely no economic sense. His objective, the way that the numbers that is shown and the way he's been communicating, putting the tariffs, then suspending the tariffs, then the tariffs are back, then suspending again. So creating this uncertainty, his objective is to weaken the US dollar, to recreate some export competitiveness for whatever is left of US manufacturing. The problem is China is also playing that game, and the Chinese central bank is much more powerful and much better at playing that game. From the time he announced the reciprocal tariffs until now, the Chinese yuan has collapsed more than the US dollar. So he's also losing that race. And then you have the cherry on cake. But that's a very ideological angle here, is that we have to remember that he's surrounded with, this so-called PayPal mafia, advisors who are very ultra-liberal in their philosophical mindset, who have a distaste for fiat currency controlled by a central bank, in that case, the Federal Reserve. So it's also one way for him, by creating this uncertainty, to prop up the interest again for cryptocurrencies, which he is directly involved in himself and many of his the people around him. So I think it's a multi-layered approach. He's probably being way too aggressive about this. I think his mistake is that he's probably targeting too many bilateral trade relations at once. So we are already seeing the limits of his strategy. But it's most likely, I'm obviously not in his head. I'm not privy to what his next move will be. But it's probably something he can live with, because he's trying to achieve quick victories so that he can go back to his electors and say, see, that can be done. Arguably, I could not do it. I could not go further enough. But that can be done. And I'm going to continue if you give me another mandate. You have to remember, we are already getting very close to the midterms in the US, where traditionally the president who is in power loses the majority. So he has a very tight time frame to do what he wants.
As you were talking about manufacturing, a thought just occurred to me, and we have discussed this a few times during our podcast, and that is the global demographic decline that all countries across the board are suffering from. Now, if you want to have growth in perpetuity, and you want to make sure that you've got a market in which you can sell all this extra stuff, you're going to have people. And of course, one of the things that we're here in Australia suffering from quite significantly is a skill shortage across most sectors. We can't get enough immigrants into the country to fill various sectors. One of the things that we're really worried about at this point in time, for a whole bunch of reasons, AUKUS. The idea of building a nuclear-powered submarine. It's Australia's version of a moonshot program, and it's very ambitious. And look, I have no problem with us being ambitious, but, we have not enough skilled people to put into the program to build the submarines out of Adelaide. This is going to be a continual problem for us moving forward, but the United States itself can't even afford to produce submarines for the US Navy because they have a skills shortage. The British themselves have a skills shortage for the similar reasons. So we're really facing a bit of a crunch economically for reasons beyond Trump. But then when you superimpose those demographic reasons onto Trumpian tariffs and trade wars and stuff, where do you think we're heading?
Um, I totally agree with you that it's very important, in spite of the fact that we are in the age of AI, of quantum computing, etc. It's very important to remember that numbers still matter. And that's exactly what you're talking about here. The skill force shortages, but it's also the skill shortages. If you look at the numbers of engineers, of AI engineers that China puts out every year, and if you look
Correct.
at the similar number that comes out of the US. I mean, there's no contest. And in the US, mind you, many of them are not even American nationals. They are
Mhm.
actually foreign students who come to the US to study this with the very high possibility, the very high likelihood that they will go back home after they graduate, considering the lack of employment opportunities and considering the general atmosphere in the US when it comes to accepting immigrants. So I think it's you're totally nailing this very important factor, the numbers. I would actually go further than this. It's not just about the numbers of people, but it's also the capacity to produce, to manufacture in large numbers. And again, with the deindustrialization that we've seen in Western countries for almost half a century, to the almost exclusive benefit of China, the big question mark is how much are we able to recreate at home to produce the numbers? When you were discussing AUKUS, so when we look strictly about defense, I will draw a parallel with where I'm from, Europe. You may have heard that the European Union has announced an 800 billion euro package to rearm
Yep.
Europe. My question
Yep.
is, first of all, I didn't know we had 800 billion euros, so that's good news. I was not aware of that. Second of all, do we still know how to make drones? Do we still know how to make advanced artillery? Do we still know how to make advanced like fifth generation fighters? And most importantly, if we answer to those yes to those two first questions, the number three question, which is my main worry, is can we produce those in amounts that are big enough to actually be relevant to today's battlefield? The war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and more importantly, the war in Ukraine, are stark reminders that, again, you need numbers. We talk about drones, fine. It's not two drones. It's 150, it's 200, because maybe 20% will hit the target. So you have to produce in massive amounts. Up until recently, I'm not sure what the numbers are as we speak, but up until recently, Russia was still producing more armored vehicles than they were losing on the battlefield. So are we able to do this? Are we able to produce enough ammunition to go for a high intensity war? I mean, if we are in Europe, as our leaders seem to believe, at a risk of a confrontation with Russia, it's out of the question that we can beat Russia in 5 days. But 5 days is more or less the amount of stocks of ammunition that European NATO armies have. So it's about numbers. So can we reindustrialize in quantities that are large enough? Some of it will necessitate a human workforce. A lot of it will be robotized. Do we have the robots to do that? Do we have enough? So I think you're spot on with the numbers. And then the demographics. One of the things that we can fall back on, I think it's true for Australia, it's true for the European Union, is that we are sizable consumption markets. I think from a European standpoint, unfortunately, this is all we are, pretty much. One big consumption market. We are not a military force anymore. Our armies are, unfortunately, sample armies. We have very good stuff, but in very tiny quantities. We are not a diplomatic force, obviously. I mean, the Iranians are not wondering what Europe is thinking at the moment. Israel is not caring much about what Europe is thinking. So we are left with being a massive consumption market. But then for that to remain an asset, you need a level of wealth in the middle class. And we are seeing at the same time, and I do believe that this is exactly the same situation in Australia, and that's the same in North America, and that's the same in Japan, and that's the same in South Korea. We are seeing a significant impoverishment of the middle class. So even that argument that at least we can weigh in the balance of power because we are buyers of last resort, even that argument is being weakened with the impoverishment of the middle class and the catastrophic demographics that we present, which will make Chinese companies think yeah, maybe today Europe, maybe today Australia are sizable consumption markets, but in 20 years down the road, no more. And as we speak, I was reading some statistics coming out of China. Chinese exporters, as a result of Trump tariffs, but also most likely looking at long-term demographics, are turning many of their exports towards Southeast Asia. Because Southeast Asia, what do they have? A middle class that is still in an enrichment process and very positive demographics.
But then again, there is this other aspect as well. We can't talk about China in isolation of the demographic decline as well, which presents China with many similar problems, but also very different problems peculiar to China and its economy and the way it's structured. I want to touch base on something before we return to the US. I want to touch base on something that you mentioned about robotics. Now, I'm fascinated by this whole notion that we're heading toward a robotic age. But one thing that I'm also fascinated about is the fact that our international supply chains are breaking down. I mean, we're not living in that sort of globalized free trade environment anymore, which was where the birth of the idea of having robotic industries came about because it looked like it was something that we could do. But now with global supply chains breaking down, is the dream of robotic factories over? Where are we going to get the robots from? Are the Chinese building them? Are the Japanese? Are the South Koreans? Are all of them? Do they share components? Because I'm sure that many of their components come from low-cost countries and they get assembled in the more developed parts of Asia and then get exported outwards. So how does that all work?
I think it's you're pinpointing a very important a trend that I think will be with us for the next 50 years, if not more, which is what we call the Galapagos effect of technology. We are seeing, because of trade wars and because of the geopolitical elements behind those issues of robotization and all the critical raw materials that are required to manufacture robots, we are seeing, walls being erected between regions, and we are seeing entire ecosystems. And that's true for the entire tech space, ecosystems that are being developed and are maturing independent from one another, and in many cases, for geopolitical reasons, voluntarily mutually exclusive. That's what we're seeing in semiconductors, that's what we're seeing in AI, and that goes for, I would say, the hardware, but the software as well, and the entire norms and standards behind, and the entire governance behind. The governance of AI, if you look at the whole debate on governance of AI, it does exist in China as well. People should not make the mistake of thinking that there is no discussion on the governance of AI in China. There is no ethic discussion of governance of AI in China. It's just the basis of that discussions are extremely different, and in many cases, totally mutually exclusive with the kind of debate we have in the Western Hemisphere. So this is, I do believe, the big risk, which means the power that's going to win that race is the power that has the capacity to be the most resilient, the most independent, the most autonomous. And in that respect, I do believe that China has a serious edge over everybody else because in many respects, they control the entire vertical of that space. They control the critical raw materials, and all the way down to the finished product. If you look at the statistics of where the critical raw materials come from robotization, but that's the same kind for renewable energy technologies, that's the same kind of result for semiconductors, it's mostly coming from China or from non-China geographies, but where China controls the supply with Chinese companies. They do the extraction, they do the transformation, the refining, the transportation. So if they don't have it at home, they control it in Africa, in Latin America, or elsewhere. Then you have the intermediary components where you start adding value. In many cases, it's also mostly coming from China. And then you have the finished product. And in many cases, the clear leaders worldwide are Chinese. I mean, for electrical, it's pretty clear. For wind power, it's pretty clear. For 3D printing, it's pretty clear. For robotization, it's becoming pretty clear as well. So whoever's going to win that race, because there is this intense war, this technological war that's come on top of the trade war, whoever's going to win that race is whoever is able to integrate vertically the entire value chain. And in that respect, In the Western Hemisphere, we have a lot of weak points. Again, if we look at Europe, I mean, we don't have access to those critical raw materials. I was looking at a chart. The Rafale. Let me take the example of the Rafale, the French fighter, 4.5 generation, possibly 5th generation with an improvement. The Rafale was made ITAR free. So in order for France to export the Rafale, we don't have to ask for permission from Washington because there's not one single US-made component in the Rafale. The problem is that as much as the Rafale is ITAR free, the Rafale is not China free, because most of the critical raw materials needed to manufacture the Rafale are sourced from China or from Chinese companies elsewhere. So the fact that China is able to weaponize the supply of critical raw materials, which they have done many times over, is actually one of the biggest weapons. And that's no surprise that the latest negotiation between the US and China in London were about precisely this. Sell us critical raw materials. Do not weaponize this.
Wow. Okay. Well, let's return to the US because I'm starting to get really depressed here very quickly. Okay. So the US Federal Reserve has warned of inflationary pressures resulting from the tariffs while consumer prices are reportedly climbing. How do you see this playing out in the US and in Europe, especially in economies already struggling with inflation inertia? Could this spark a new round of stagflation in developed markets?
Absolutely. The answer is yes, yes, and yes. We are headed for a form of stagflation. I'm afraid that it's going to be a pretty severe form. I do believe that it serves the purpose of attempting to reindustrialize. I mean, let's be clear about this. The average American, the average European is not ready to go back to the factory. Okay.
No, yeah.
They've been very comfortable. So in order for that to happen, if we are able to make it happen, and that's a big if, do we still know how to manufacture this stuff? Do we have the quantity? Where are we going to find the money, etc.? That's a big if. But if this condition is met, you're going to have a serious impoverishment, a further impoverishment of the middle class for them to accept that deal. Okay, let's go back to work in a factory because there's no option. There's no other option out there. There's no more employment opportunities in the tertiary sector. So I think it's a necessary impoverishment, and I think that's part of the plan. That's part of the program.
But will this actually... Well, one moment, Nicholas. Will this actually revitalize the middle class in a strange kind of way moving forward? I mean, if that indeed is what's going to happen, or is it like we're just going to be third world in terms of the way that we develop ourselves?
I think we're gonna go on the way to becoming third world again, because let's be honest. Let's reopen some textile factories in Australia, Europe, or the US. Are we going to sell that textile at 5 times the price that the Chinese or Ecuador or Vietnam or Bangladesh are selling it? No, because we still have to sell it to someone. So we're going to have to drop down significantly the cost of labor in our own countries. And how do you do that?
By impoverishing ourselves.
Absolutely. So that stagflation, I believe, it's something that is part of the program. It's not a bug. It's in the plan. And as you can see, nothing serious is being done as we speak in our countries to shield the middle class from that inflation. Nothing serious is being done.
You know, the US Court of International Trade ruled that Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, known by that very clumsy acronym, the IEEPA, for tariffs, lacks legal basis, but the tariffs remain during the appeal. Do you view this as an abuse of presidential authority over trade, and could this set a dangerous precedent for economic nationalism overriding democratic or legal constraints?
Not being a legal expert, I will be prudent in my answer to the first part of your question. It's possible that there is a case to argue that there is a high degree of illegality in what Trump is doing, but I would say that it doesn't really matter. The precedents, I mean, Trump is about precedents. Everything he does is about precedents. Attacking his own allies first with tariffs, that was a pretty clear precedent, especially the numbers that he put out. What he's working on with the Canal of Panama, that's a precedent. And he uses military precedents to actually threaten us of something actually worse, which I don't believe is a realistic scenario, but that's what he always does. He promises you hell so that he doesn't have to actually deliver on it. The way he's been speaking to the Kingdom of Denmark about Greenland, that's another precedent. The way he's been considering Canada, that's another precedent in the way that is, I'm aware that those debates did not appear this year. They were around before, but he's really pushing those debates much further than they've ever been before. So he's putting a lot of precedents in front of us because that's his way. I mean, if you read his book again, The Art of the Deal, that's exactly how he explains that he achieves deals, that he arms wrestles you, and that he forces you, that he coerces you into making deals by setting many of those precedents and by being willing to at least show that he's willing to go extremely far in radical decisions, radical moves to try to scare you off and force you to the negotiating table. So I would say whether there is legality in what he's doing is not very important at this point. Everybody, starting with their historical allies of the US, have understood by now that the least reliant trade partner there is on this planet is the United States of America. Even the historical allies have to recognize that. I mean, come on, to make Ursula von der Leyen, Bruno Macron change their mind about this, I mean, you got to go very radical because those people are pro-globalization as they get. So even they have to recognize that, okay, the game has changed. The speech by J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference was the act of divorce between the US and the European Union, I believe. So we have to come to that realization now. The question is, especially for us, Australians, Europeans, Japanese, do we have it in us to take our own future into our own hands? Do we have it in us to modify our entire strategic view of the world? Are we able to change our mindset and change our software? And I'm afraid that from what I see so far, it's going to be very difficult for us to do so. We still have in Europe a lot of opposition to mellowing down our stance when it comes to China. Not because China should be considered as a friend. I'm not saying China should be considered as a friend, but we are still very much in this copy-paste confrontation with China that we got from the US. And we need to change that. Our geography is not the same. I think it's about time that our countries realize that geography matters. What the US can afford to do comes a lot from their geography. They're protected by two big oceans. We are not. Australia is not. Australia is on the front row. So we have to take that into account. We don't choose who our neighbors are. And from what I see, they have no intention of moving.
Oh, okay, you've said a lot. Now let me see if I can sort of. There was something about what we were discussing earlier about the destruction of the middle classes in the West. Does that come with devaluing our respective currencies as well? Because arguably, our currencies are still pegged too high for us to be competitive with low-cost countries. So that would require us to then, I don't know, just have no value in the currency at all, really. If we're picking ourselves against, say, Southeast Asian countries, African countries, countries that still have younger workforces, are much more dynamic workplaces, where we once all were, but they are now and we are not. How bad can it possibly get?
I think we are stuck between a rock and a hard place when it comes to the value of the currency and how much we can use it to regain some form of competitiveness, the way that China is doing now, the way that Japan has done in the 1980s, etc. We are stuck between this sad fact that we've deindustrialized massively. So we don't have much of a manufacturing base anymore. And we have leaders in Europe, the European Central Bank, that is stuck in an ideology, because it is what this is. It's an ideology now. It's not even fiscal policy. It's fiscal ideology. It's almost like a religion that prevents them from acting on the value of the euro to actually regain this competitiveness. So we're stuck between this and the fact that we use the strength of our currencies, albeit, I think, to a large extent, fictitious strength. I'm usually one who says that the euro is not a strong currency, it's an expensive currency. It's not a reflection of the inner strength of European economies, but it's an expensive currency. And we need that so-called strength of the currency because it's one tool of influence for us. It's the same for the US. It's their largest leverage for influence, which is why we have this powerful trend within BRICS to actually de-dollarize as quickly as possible the world economy. Because if you actually make US power through the US dollar fall, then you actually have the entire building of U.S. influence that starts to crumble. So I think we're stuck between those two contradicting factors, and we don't have, I think, the realistic view that China has, that at times it needs to be used as economic and power leverage. You need to be able to use a currency as such without having that religious fiscal policy that prevents you to do so. I would also add that we've gone so far in denouncing all those countries that supposedly manipulate the exchange rate of their currency that it would be difficult for us to do that openly now without losing face. So we've also kind of cornered ourselves into a very tight corner where it becomes a solution that is very difficult to resort to.
So, when you talk about the religious crusader type mentality, I mean, I recall back in the early 1990s here in Australia, when I was just a poor PhD student from Canberra. I fell in with a crowd of people who were very economic rationalist. At that time, that's what we called, the neoliberals. They were coming in from left field. We were starting to break down the mixed economy here in Australia. We wanted to sell off all government assets, and that was the latest, greatest thing. So, now we've got this system which basically has become an ideology of sorts. It's all about traditional rules-based and multilateral this and that. But it's all breaking down. So if it's breaking down, and if the US is leading the charge in breaking it down, for all the reasons that you've said, America's allies can't be looking at this situation from a position of optimism, because, I mean, you paint the picture about Europe, but I can paint the picture about Australia. Europe is still more advanced in its thinking because it will recognize the threat and will try to do something. Whether it succeeds or not is entirely different. But Australia is so dependent on the good graces of the United States and also China that we have no other choice but either flip toward one side, flip toward the other. But I think we're rapidly coming to a point where the two great powers that run us effectively, the Chinese on an economic side, the Americans on the strategic, they're going to put pressure on us to choose sides. And this is where it becomes very difficult for a country like Australia. And we've got this government, and I tell you, Nicholas, unless we end up in a warlike situation or some horrible calamity, is upon us, they will not wake up to themselves. They will deny that the world has changed. They still believe in the traditional rules-based order. They still believe in multilateralism. They think that there's a path back to the good old days without actually breaking it all down. And I think that there is where, I suppose people who come from a political left situation are a little bit more delusional in that sense, because I think that there you can see that they are following their ideology into the grave rather than sit back and say, hang on a tick, we need to rethink this. If we rethink it, we'll survive. If we don't rethink it, we're going to go the way of the dodo.
I agree with you. I think you're a little bit harsh on the people coming from the left of the political spectrum. Not that I'm a leftist myself, far from it, but I'm witnessing this across the entire spectrum.
Yeah.
My analysis is that we are looking at a cognitive bias, a very strong cognitive bias on the part of all the political and business elites throughout the Western Hemisphere. They don't have a solution. Because they don't have a solution, they pretend that we can still find a way to revive the old ways. Not because they believe that the old ways are still relevant, just because they don't know what else to do. And I think, to me, it's very clear in Europe. From what I know of Australia, I think you are pretty much in the same situation, if not worse. We've cornered ourselves. We've gone so deep in economic, military, diplomatic vassality to the US that it looks like there is no way out. So what do you do when there is no way out?
Well, the system has to come apart at some point because the system is unsustainable. Because all these contradictions that are built up over the years, they're now all coming to a head because those people that used to ignore the contradictions and carry on regardless, they don't really exist anymore. And if they do exist, they exist in places like Canberra, maybe in Brussels, maybe in the European capitals, but they're becoming a dying order. And eventually the tsunami of change is going to hit us because it is going to be people like Donald Trump. It's going to be the nationalist right wing within the European context, and even the MAGAs in America, who are going to be the new drivers, whether we want to admit to it or not. Right?
Agreed. And I think for that, there is a need for a change of generation and change of leadership. It's impossible for our current leaders to actually say we were wrong. And when I say our current leaders, I mean, I'm aware that Macron or Albanese, they have not been in power for 20 years, but they are from the same ideology that's been in power for 40 years. So that ideology has to admit that we were wrong all along. And we all know that they will never do that. I mean, this is the exact situation we're in Europe, when we are being asked to trust the people who've disarmed us for 40 years to rearm us now. They are the same people. And we're supposed to trust them to rearm us when they've disarmed us for 40 years. So I think it's easier for them to say that, no, we are still right. It's just that Trump has gone mad and China is a new danger. So they are sticking to their guns. Our ways, it's now the third way, this famous third way that nobody cares about, by the way. I mean, if you travel throughout the so-called global south, which I do, nobody cares about the European third way. They're all hesitating between the US way or the Chinese way, full stop. And more and more of them actually going towards the Chinese way. I think a Chinese ex-general who now teaches geopolitics at Tsinghua University in Beijing wrote a very interesting column in the South China Morning Post last year. The question that was asked to him is China, who's winning in the global south? And he starts with this article with the answer, China has won already. The real question is who's going to win in Europe? The only battlefield is Europe.
Yes, it is. And I think that the more tumultuous the relationship between Brussels and Washington gets, and I've had this theory all along that, the only option that European leaders will have is to swing toward China and use China as their hedge against the United States, which I know sounds weird now, but if we had this conversation, say, 10 years from now, we might be in that world. So it's a very strange situation. It's very strange.
I agree with you. The automotive sector it's a perfect example. The legacy automakers in Europe, they're all dying off one after the other, crumbling under the assaults of Chinese EV cars that are coming to Europe. There's no way we can compete with them on quality and price at the same time, which is why now the European Union is considering putting an end to the tariffs on Chinese EVs and try to renegotiate and obtain from China that they accept a minimum level of price so that they don't kill the likes of Volkswagen or Stellantis or Renault too quickly. But we're not going to have any choice.
Yes, God help me. All right. You're listening to The Focus with me, Dr. John Bruni. If you're enjoying today's conversation with Nicolas Michelon on the global fallout of Trump's tariffs, don't forget to like and subscribe to The Focus podcast on YouTube and on your favorite podcast platform. Your support goes a long way in keeping independent global conversations like this one going strong. Now back to the show. God, Nicolas. All right. How do you assess the risk that this tariff war could fracture the global economy into competing trade blocs? I mean, we talked about BRICS earlier, but is this a 21st century Cold War style economic bifurcation? And what role will BRICS play in shaping such an outcome? I mean, you've just mentioned China and, like the global south and its leadership in the global south. Do you see that the Chinese are going to be consolidating not just their economic control over places like Africa, but also their strategic control? Um, yes.
Absolutely. I think this bifurcation, it has already started. It did start, albeit discreetly, under the first Trump administration when he started his trade war with Europe, Canada, Mexico, and then China, and then Australia and
Mm.
others. It opened the Pandora's box basically, because if
Yeah.
you notice, if you look at the sequence of events that unfolded in Trump's first administration, he starts with Europe, Canada, Mexico, very quickly Australia, then he goes on to China, which is the bulk
Mm.
of his policy, and then at the same time, supposedly because of COVID, you start having a multiplication of mini trade wars. I mean, Australia knows about it. You
Yeah.
guys were in your own mini trade war with China when your previous prime minister asked for an international investigation into the origins of COVID. Then
Correct.
Japan and South Korea got into their mini trade war over some unresolved historical issues, the so-called women of comfort issue.
Mm.
So they went into tariffs, nationalization of assets, export controls, etc. So it's really opened the Pandora's box. And what I'm seeing now with the second wave of trade war and those reciprocal tariffs started by Trump on April the 2nd is that basically now no country on this planet virtually is afraid of going into a trade war. You want one? Okay, you got one. So it's
Okay.
really opened this Pandora's box. It's accelerating the fact that the WTO, the World Trade Organization, is becoming increasingly irrelevant to solve those trade conflicts, to prevent those trade conflicts. It still exists. China, for the sake of its own narrative that consists in saying we are not, contrary to the US, we are not afraid of multilateralism. China still participates, but China clearly retaliates on a bilateral basis now to whatever the US is doing to them. So I think this bifurcation had started with Trump 1. It's obviously accelerating now. When you look at the statistics now, the Asia Pacific is doing most of its trade within itself already.
Yeah. Yeah.
Within itself. I was mentioning those numbers earlier in our discussion. Most Chinese exporters now, as a result of the second round of tariffs by Trump 2.0, are accelerating the development of export markets in Southeast Asia, which, by the way, it's good news for the environment. The carbon footprint is lower. It's more ENG. It's more easy to make it ESG compliant. So it actually kills several birds with one stone. But it is already happening. And when you tag onto to that the issue of the norms and standards, which is extremely important, that are tagged to the products that are being exported, the norms and standards, just like what I discussed before with the tech space, are becoming increasingly mutually exclusive. So that's reinforcing this trend of multi-polarized world with economic blocks that are reappearing. And then to the last part of your question, specifically about BRICS, that's a fantastic opportunity for BRICS to present an alternative. BRICS is not a third way, let's be clear. Huh? In BRICS, you have R, which is Russia, and C, which is China. So it's not a third way. It's controlled by one of the sides of the political divide. But that's definitely a fantastic opportunity for BRICS to expand and to speed up what their master plan is, which is the de-dollarization of the world economy. When I mean de-dollarization, I don't mean the creation of a BRICS currency. I don't believe that a BRICS currency is feasible, at least not in the near future, in the foreseeable future. It's too complex, economically speaking. The banking systems of the countries that participate in BRICS are nowhere near ready for that. But my argument is that for every % of international trade that is not done in US dollar anymore, that's a small victory by that side of the political divide against US influence. Every 1% of trade that is not labeled in US dollar, it's a small victory. every single step is a small victory, because it reminds countries that want to participate there is a way out of unipolarity. There is a way out of the almost Pavlovian reflex of sanctions embargoes.
Mhm.
And one of the main leverage of sanctions embargoes is the US dollar. So there
Mhm.
is a way out for this. And more countries are participating. I mean, you saw the phase of expansion at the beginning of 2024. Even the UAE joined.
Mhm.
Mohammed
Yes,
bin
yes.
Zayed, the president of the UAE, which is a very
Yeah.
clear US ally, was
Mm.
present at the BRICS meeting in Kazan
Mhm.
last summer, and they are now active, and they are now starting export contracts of oil to India paid in Indian rupees. So it
So
is
in actual,
happening.
so in actual fact, I mean, we're looking at the death of the US dollar by 1,000 cuts rather than a wholesale replacement anytime soon. Is that what I'm getting?
Absolutely, absolutely. A very
Right.
slow death. I would not disagree if we didn't even use the word death, because it probably will not die in terms of an
Mm.
international currency for trade, but just taking an entire chunk of that cake away from the US dollar.
Mm,
And
mm,
that
mm.
will be enough. Because again, the objective here is to offer not a replacement, an alternative. An alternative. The message of the BRICS is, in more and more cases now, you're going to have the choice.
So, okay, let's look at sectoral disruptions. The tech, agriculture, and consumer retail sectors have been among the hardest hit by rising costs and retaliatory tariffs. Which industries do you believe are most at risk in Europe and Asia? And are there any that might actually benefit from Trump's protectionism? Protectionism, I should say.
It's getting very difficult now to identify a single sector that will not be hit directly or indirectly. I was actually contributing comments to a UAE-based media recently, and they were asking this very question. For the UAE, which arguably is more shielded than Europe or other countries in terms of US tariffs, and even there, indirectly, because they source many of their inputs. For example, the construction sector is starting to feel the pain because
Right.
they're sourcing many of the materials from outside of the UAE. And on paper, you could argue that the construction sector in the UAE should be pretty much preserved. The UAE is under only 10% tariff, which is the lowest, the minimum. And it is by definition a sector that is not exposed to international trade, but they still are indirectly. So obviously, there are some sectors that are hardest hit. I'm very worried, as I said before, about the European automobile industry, because there are some components that do come from North America. They do sell in North America, especially German brands, not so much French brands, but German brands. The likes of Stellantis. Which is listeners have to remember that Stellantis is the combination of Peugeot, Citroën of France and Fiat Chrysler of
Hmm.
Italy / the US. So they still have a lot of brands that sell pretty well in North America. So those are getting the prospects for those companies are getting worrisome. By the way, the CEO of Stellantis, the new CEO of Stellantis, is going to be based in the US now.
Mm. Mm.
It's a
Okay.
European company. It's a
Right.
European company. The CEO will be based in the US. That's the message.
Mm.
The shipping industry is under a lot of stress for obvious reasons. Freight numbers are going down. The cost of freight is going through the roof.
Mm.
And that's not just Trump tariffs, that's also the entire geopolitics. When the
Yeah.
Houthis were firing missiles and drones in the Strait of Bab el Mandeb in the Red Sea, that propped up freight rates a lot, insurance rates that increased massively, transit times, because for certain periods you could not sail through the Suez Canal. You had to sail all around Africa. So shipping lines are getting hit. Ship makers are under a lot of pressure. French ship maker CMA CGM, which is the third largest container line in the world, they were coerced by the US to make more container ships in the US. Some of you may remember that Trump actually paraded the French CEO of CMA CGM, in the Oval Office with a map showing the Gulf of America behind,
Hmm. Hmm.
and making him say that CMA CGM now commits to manufacturing many more container ships in the US, most likely in Texas and Louisiana, possibly. I would say all sectors are getting hit, some of them more directly than others, but there's virtually no sector that is unhindered. The financial services sector was hit before already under Biden with the IRA, with the Inflation Reduction Act, and now because they are obviously financing international trade, they are being hit as well. So there's virtually no sector that can say, I'm getting off the hook on this one.
You mentioned something that I think is really interesting, and it has a strategic impact, a military strategic impact on us, and that is after World War II, there was this spoken, non-spoken agreement that the US Navy would act as a guarantor for the free movement of shipping. Now, that was fine. Everyone sort of signed up to that, at least from a Western perspective. And even those countries that weren't quite developed yet, because China didn't really kick off until the opening in 1978. But and even then, it took them quite some time before they really became the power that they became. But the thing is that the US Navy was the guarantor. Many countries benefited from that. And now we're seeing an absolute breakdown in naval security. You mentioned the Houthis, but if the Iran war becomes, well, if it goes to its natural endpoint, which is the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, that's going to cause another major international choke point. It's going to have a huge impact on the global economy. So what role then will a very large, dare I say, bloated Chinese fleet that has yet to really exercise its power beyond the first island chain, what will it do? Will it step up to the plate and act as a sort of international guarantor of trade?
I think the time is not right for China to play that role, and they know it. I think eventually they will play that role. Eventually, I think it is their strategy, again, to offer an alternative to the US-led order. So
Right.
in that respect, they have to offer that possibility. We will be the ones that protect you. But before they do that, they need to keep attracting more goodwill from many other powerful nations in the global south. And they need to give the opportunity for the US to continue destroying their own influence so that they can come and the answer will be a natural yes, please be this alternative. Right now, China still needs to get Taiwan back. China still has a lot of clashes with Vietnam, with the Philippines in their immediate neighborhood. So it would be difficult now for China to propose to play that role because many of their immediate neighbors say, thank you, but no thank you. You are the problem for us right now. So once they've solved that issue, which I believe they will, I do believe that Taiwan, it's a done deal. The only question is when and how, and we have to pray that it doesn't go through a scenario of military confrontation, but I think it's a done deal. Taiwan will go back to China, hopefully in the best case scenario with the same kind of scenario as Hong Kong. Then China can start playing that role because then less and less countries will be nervous at the sight of a Chinese military ship. And in the meantime, they have to let the opportunity for the US to continue sabotaging its own influence, which they are doing like better than everybody else. It's a little bit like Aikido. Aikido, there's not much I can do if you don't attack me. What I'm being taught is to use your strength against you. The more aggressively you attack me, the harder I can hit you. So it's kind of like this. Let that momentum, the US is going into that momentum. Trump was elected partially on no more wars. He's not finding a way out of the Ukraine war because he doesn't have the patience. He's definitely not finding any way to stop Israel in Gaza. And now he's letting a new confrontation happen. So if I'm China and India and Pakistan, by the way. So if I'm China, I continue to let that happen. I do nothing to prevent the US from losing that influence by showing their lack of leadership. And during that time, I keep building up my influence until a point. I'm not saying I'm able to identify the precise tilting point, but at least up to a point where China can actually not be confronted with any nervous reactions. And I think that could be the issue of Taiwan.
All right, on the issue of Taiwan, what happens if Trump does a deal with China and sells Taiwan out? Which to me makes sense if I was Trump. I mean, I'm a transactional guy. I want to make a deal. I don't want to go to war with China. I mean, I don't mind, economic competition and all that kind of stuff. Not that it looks like you're very confident that they'd win that, but nonetheless, he doesn't want to have a war with China. So I think that the rational aspect of Trump will be that he will then sign a deal with Xi Jinping saying, hey, listen, we're going to step back. We're not going to do anything about Taiwan. You go ahead and do it. It's your part of China, blah, blah, blah. And that really puts a fly in the ointment of everything because it could actually accelerate China's rise, at least temporarily, because they will then have been given a gift. They won't necessarily have to use military force to conquer the island state. It'll just be a piece of paper and the signature between the US president and the Chinese president. That'll be it. Taiwan's future is determined, and then the Chinese could then start flexing their muscles elsewhere in Asia to create that hegemonic impact that you were describing earlier.
As I said before, I think that the future of Taiwan, it's a done deal already. The only question to me is in what way, what will be the exact scenario, the exact timing. But I think if we look at the long term, we're all dead. But I think in the long term, Taiwan will be back to China in one form or another. It's true that it is something that can be expected of someone like Donald Trump. With this very transactional approach to things. The fact that they are encouraging a hollowing out of Taiwanese tech is a bad sign for the future of an independent Taiwan. I mean, if TSMC is to replicate most of its production capacities in Arizona, then, well, you don't need to protect Taiwan anymore. I do remember at one point reading a paper from an American think tank, which cannot be suspected of being anti-American, that actually reported what some people in the Pentagon advise Taiwan to do. They say, if China attacks, destroy yourself, your own infrastructures. Like do what the Russians did in front of Napoleon and in front of Hitler.
Yep.
Burn everything so that you make yourself undesirable. So I think it's something that is worrying for Taiwan. I agree with you that it's still a scary sight because it will send a very powerful message to South Korea, to Japan, to the Philippines that, guys, you're on your own now.
Yeah.
You are obviously on your own.
And then there's the nuclear proliferation aspect, because when people think that they're on their own, they're going to go to nukes because nukes are going to guarantee them their sovereignty going forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would like to still maybe bring a little bit of temperance in these kind of scenarios. I think my criticism when we talk about Trump is that we tend to forget that he is Trump, but he's American president. And the US, amongst the democracies out there, is the democracy where you have the most counterpowers to the president. Had it been France leading the world, I can tell you the constitution of the Fifth Republic that we have in France since the end of the Second World War, it's almost like a monarchy. The French president does anything he wants. That is not the case in the US. A lot of counterpowers. He already knows that if history, if tradition, political tradition is respected, he will lose majority in the primaries, in the midterms next year. So the US president doesn't do everything he wants, first of all, in terms of the way that the Constitution was written. And second of all, the deep state in the US is very powerful. It is very powerful. I think that's one of the aspects where I would agree with Trump. There is a very strong deep state that is bent towards exercising full hegemony. So as much as Trump is transactional and maybe tempted by saying, let's sign a deal over Taiwan, just like with over everything else, I'm not sure that the US deep state, which includes the military industrial complex, pretty much agrees with that. Will he have time? Will he be re-elected to do that? I don't think that question will be asked to him before the midterms. And will he have the majority to actually go down that road. So I think in general, also in terms of trade, we have to be careful when we talk about what Trump is doing. We have to remember that he's the president of the US, a country, a nation that was built. The fathers of the Republic wanted something very different from the British Crown. Remember what they reproached to the British Crown, that they were too centralized power and that they were crushed by that centralized power. So they created their own constitution so that this doesn't happen again. And there are a lot of counterpowers, which is not the case in many European democracies. So
Oh, that's true. Well, I was just thinking, if what you're saying is correct, and Trump senses that he's only got limited time to be president, and say it all ends at the midterms, because then the balance of power swings against him quite significantly, I would say. Is there a danger that Trump is just forcing stuff out in such haste that a lot of the stuff that he's putting out there isn't just bad policy, it's just badly thought out policy? He's doing it because he knows he's got a legacy to maintain when he leaves office. He knows he's got a limited amount of time while he still has power before power shifts in Washington toward the Democrats again. And so he's pushing and pushing and pushing. But as we all know, once you start rushing and you're not thinking strategically about where you're placing your country, you can make significant mistakes that are going to really come home and roost at some point. And it doesn't matter who ends up becoming president after Trump. The damage that Trump can do now until November of next year is quite significant. And it would take many administrations to try to just make a dent in the damage that a Trump administration could do. So yes, checks and balances, absolutely, but still time enough to do a lot of damage, irrespective.
I agree. Time enough to do a lot of damage, time enough to profoundly change the rule book of how things are done. But again, remember Trump 1.0 followed by Biden. Biden did not undo what Trump started in terms of foreign policy. He continued it.
True.
He took Trump's trade war and turned it into a tech war. The IRA is one massive body of legislation that is aimed at killing European competition, hitting their own allies first again. So I think we have to be careful not to be blinded by the surface opposition. Granted, Trump and Biden will not go on vacation together. Granted, they totally disagree on domestic policies, the right to bear arms, abortion, immigration. Yes, but when it comes to us, you and I, who are not American, citizens of the rest of the world, what we are concerned about when it comes to the US is foreign policy and international trade policy. And in that respect, I notice a lot of continuity between Democrats and Republicans. And in terms of foreign policy, remember, Trump picks up from Obama's pivot to the Pacific and turns it into the Indo-Pacific, trying to weaponize India, which is a big failure, to finish encircling China. But that was a continuity of what Obama did. So thank God, foreign policy doesn't change every 4 years. But there is continuity. And I think the world has learned this. And that's what I was saying in the beginning of our discussion. Right about now, everybody on this planet, starting with the most staunch allies of the US, the historical allies, everyone has realized that the US is the least reliable partner there is on this planet. Even Europeans, even Australians have started to realize this. And that's saying a lot.
It is. Nicolas, thanks for joining us again and for sharing your insights on the focus.
Thank you so much, John.
Trump's tariffs weren't just about trade, they were about power. They challenged long-held assumptions about globalization, economic interdependence, and America's role in the world economy. Whether they evolve into something beneficial for average Americans, one thing's for certain: the age of geoeconomics is here to stay. From France, that was Nicolas Michelon, founder and CEO of Asia Power Watch and managing partner at Allegan Partners. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Nicolas Michelon. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about Nicolas and connect with him on social media. Now on to questions for the audience. Do you believe tariffs are an effective tool for protecting national industries, or do they ultimately harm the global economy? How should countries like Australia respond to a renewed US trade war under Trump 47? Lie down and take it or push back? Are we witnessing the end of free trade as we knew it, or is this all just a recalibration of the global economic order? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producer of The Focus, Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. And don't forget Blue Sky on thefocuspod.adl.bsky.social. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.